Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. This is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Professor of Economics at University College London. Mariana Mazzucato is a thinker, an academic. She's the author of many books. She's an advisor to many governments. Her latest work, which she's done with one of her students, Rosie Collington, is called The Big Con: How the Consulting Industry Weakens Our Businesses, Infantilizes Our Governments, and Warps Our Economies. And this is very timely as we look to a period sort of building up to an election. Labour is talking about new ideas for government.
Yeah.
But first of all, what are consultants? Who are consultants? What do they do?
Sure. I mean, maybe if I can just step back 2 seconds, the reason it matters to ask the question you've just asked is who are the actors in the economy? And within that, who are the consultants? We sometimes forget there's lots of different types of actors. There's public actors, private actors. There's all sorts of intermediaries, including increasingly philanthropies in the space of health, for example, the Gates Foundation. And there's these consultants. And any challenge we have, whether it's climate change or health, requires lots of different types of actors to collaborate, to really foster collective intelligence between them. And consultants, I would say, are some of the least known. These are advisors, companies that actually, there's an industry called the consulting industry. The famous names might be McKinsey, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte. And what we look at is that the answer of who are they has actually changed over time. They used to be on the sidelines, literally advising, consulting, in the same way that you might imagine a head teacher might even be consulting. A nurse could be consulting. A doctor could be consulting. But first of all, it's on the side of what they do, and they're bringing in their expertise to the area, right? And what we look at is how this consulting industry has changed over time from being on the sidelines, advising literally on the side, to actually doing, being at the center. And we look at what has actually happened then to the different actors that they are consulting and advising along the way.
I mean, underlying all of this, I suppose, is decades now of belief that the public sector, government, just isn't very good at delivering things. And I suppose that dates back to the 70s in this country, and British Leyland and British Rail, and the idea of a country that was broken because the government was trying to run everything. I mean, why are we still hobbled by this idea that the government can't do anything, but the private sector, which keeps making mistakes, can?
Well, first of all, the private sector, when it does make mistakes, what's interesting is sometimes it even brags about those mistakes. Just, speak to any venture capitalist. They'll say, for every success, we had to, actually go through 7 or 8 failures. That's true with almost everything, right? Like riding a bicycle, you have to fall off before you learn how to, ride it properly. And yet, as soon as a civil servant fails, it's on the front page of the Daily Mail or whatever, right? We blame the civil service when they make mistakes without actually asking, well, are they also investing in their ability to learn from those mistakes? Because the problem, of course, is not making the mistake, is if you're making constantly the same mistakes. That means you're not learning. You're not a learning organization. And so there's been, as you just said, a lot of ideology in the last kind of 5 decades that has kind of put out this idea that value is created in the business sector. That's where kind of the key decisions and strategy should be made, and government is there kind of on the sidelines, set the rules of the game,
Regulate.
And then get out of the way. Regulate, administer, redistribute, but this idea that you're actually not at the center of the system creating value. Now, you talked about the 70s. In my previous book, Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, I look at what was happening in NASA, the space agency in the United States, during the Apollo program. And the head of procurement, I'm actually a nerd about procurement policy. I've become convinced it's like the lever that every government should be using to transform their economy. So this is government as purchaser, right? You purchase stuff that is required to make hospitals, schools, and so on. The head of procurement realized that, first of all, to get to the moon, they had to change all the ways that they were doing government, including how procurement was being done. It had to be outcomes oriented. It can't just be money given out to companies just to kind of be involved in the space. The other thing, really interesting, he said, if we keep outsourcing our brain to other actors, because that was already happening in the 60s. We will ultimately get captured by brochuremanship. So remember, NASA worked with businesses in every single sector, from nutrition, materials, electronics, software. There were so many different challenges to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. And he said, the problem is not whether we work with the private sector. It's, will we even know who to work with? Will we know how to write the terms of reference? Will we know when, there's a good contract versus a bad contract if we outsource our brain? And he said, no. And we will get captured by what you would call today PowerPoints, but at the time they were brochures. And it was such a deep point, because that's actually what I think has happened.
Hasn't it already happened? I was going to say,
Absolutely,
because the
totally
excuse for the mistakes that happened during COVID was, well, it was an emergency. We just had to get things done. You hear Matt Hancock saying this all the time. We just had to get the PPE. We just had to get everything. Of course, we were going to make mistakes.
So the reason the subtitle of the book, The Big Con, one of the subtitles is as how the consulting industry has infantilized government, is that there was a conservative lord in the UK government, his name is Lord Agnew, who, on the back of seeing all the contracts that the government was giving to the McKinseys, the PwCs, and the Deloittes, both for Brexit and then for COVID, he's like, oh my God, if we continue this, we will be, or we are, infantilizing Whitehall. In other words, making government full of babies, basically, that aren't learning. And this was from a conservative, right? Because sometimes we think that it's just the conservatives who, think that we should diminish government. This is someone who had high hopes for government, was seeing just all this outsourcing of internal capacity to the consultants, and was worried that it would dismantle, decimate, render infants Whitehall. So it's a really, really deep point. I mean, we should also remember that, of course, during COVID, some very good things happened. Not only did we come up with kind of 8 different vaccines globally, but in this country, it was also rolled out very efficiently and dynamically. But who was responsible? The NHS. How? Through a decentralized network of GP practices. What did we learn from that success? Are we increasing the funding to the NHS? Are we rendering this decentralized network of GP practices even more innovative and dynamic? Are we, asking the people working in them, what else do you need? And kind of bringing them to the center of an industrial strategy around being prepared for the next pandemic? No.
Yes, the answer is no, isn't it?
No, absolutely not.
Even Labour is talking about the future being actually about using the private sector more.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other question. Should we go into that? Because that's like opening up a big can of worms, which is, if everything I'm saying is a problem, what's the solution? And, if we even have Labor governments or the Democratic Party in the US still kind of not really finding a new narrative and just making the existing narrative a bit softer. So, yes, of course, we believe in government and we need government to help kind of steer the economy, but we can only do it with the private sector at the wheel. And we need to be, in quotes, business friendly, which I think is one of the most dysfunctional concepts ever, because we need to work with business. You need those 400,000 people to get us to the moon and back. You need sectors as different as nutrition, electronics, materials for fighting climate change. But it's not about one side being friendly to the other. It's not about one side de-risking the other. It's not about one side enabling the other. Just think of any partnership in a couple. Just the word partnership isn't necessarily a good thing. It depends what kind of partnership. An ecosystem, if you speak to any biologist, it's not necessarily a good thing. You can have a parasitic ecosystem. You can have a predator-prey ecosystem. You can have a mutualistic, a symbiotic one. So the big question for any progressive party, whether it's Labor or anywhere in the world, is how do we really develop a mutualistic, symbiotic partnership between the public, the private, the civil society sector, and really foster collective intelligence? It might sound like a big word, but what that means is we need a lot of different people to work together to reduce the digital divide, to have net zero regions, to strengthen our kind of ability to be more prepared with the next health pandemic, and we're going to have a lot more as climate change melts the permafrost and new viruses come out. So all these complex, wicked challenges, which, by the way, underlie all the Sustainable Development Goals, which every country, including the UK, signed up to since 2015, require able, capable actors. So is the government capable? Well, if it hasn't been investing in its own, brain, perhaps not sometimes. And also really dynamic partnerships between the different actors where the contracts are also transparent. And we saw this with the vaccine. AstraZeneca, when it worked with the Oxford University researchers, actually agreed to reducing the cost, because of access, because the mission was not the vaccine, the mission was to vaccinate the world. That's the mission. They agreed to share knowledge. They agreed to make sure that it was a vaccine that didn't have to be stored at such a low temperature that would be inaccessible to countries in the global south. So that's not because AstraZeneca is perfect. There's many problems in every company and every public organization as well. But the deal was negotiated, right? And so, this is the issue. Governments need to be good at not just talking the talk, but really setting the deals, but also co-investing, co-innovating. And the big problem we raise in the book is that what we've seen is that it's not so much about austerity, which everyone talks about. Money comes and goes, but organizational competence doesn't. And when you destroy a public organization, think of what's happening in this country with the BBC, it can take decades for it to come back.
Right, but I mean, given most of these sort of cuts in terms of what government departments do and the expertise they have largely happened.
Yeah.
And the consultants are already in delivering a lot of government programs now. What is wrong with the idea that competition produces better outcomes? That if you get different consultants bidding for a government contract, you will get something better, you'll get better value for money.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And so you could unpick it in different ways. But the first thing is what we already raised, that what we've seen is not that this has actually increased quality. There's failures, constant failures, but very little accountability. We go through, the other subtitle there is how it has weakened our businesses. We go through what we call the history of capitalism has been history of consulting. A lot of uncomfortable decisions that have been made in business by business. We don't blame the consultants. And it's not to say there aren't smart people in consulting companies. In fact, that's the other problem. We have a brain drain from our best universities and top graduates going into the consulting industry instead of going into government. And, it'd be great if we could reverse that trend, not because government is so much better than any other organization, but if we can't attract some of our most dynamic and creative people into the civil service, we're going to have a problem.
Don't those consultancy groups become experts?
No.
And through their own failure, learn.
If this was about kind of side issues, peripheral issues, then what you're saying, I could actually say, yeah, okay, fine. If it was about setting up a catering department for a university, it's not central to what the university does. You might get it wrong the first year, but you'll learn over time. If we're talking about the core role of a university, the core role of a government, the core role of a health system, of course it matters if those that you're bringing in actually don't have that expertise. And again, you wouldn't do it. You actually wouldn't do that for other problems. So why are we allowing government? Why do we dismiss the ability of government? And by the way, in many of the examples we bring up in the book are where government does have the expertise.
So why do you think then, if it's not their past failures, governments don't have confidence in their own?
Well, they've been told they're rubbish, and even Dominic Cummings, who in this country, I think, did, tried at least to bring up the whole issue of government competence and the need for, changing how we build our bureaucracy is something I'm very interested in. Again, my whole institute is about how do we create dynamic and creative bureaucracies instead of slow and inertial ones. Again, first thing NASA did was change how it organized its bureaucracy in order to get to the moon. But if you think of the language that he had was, we need to bring geeks into government and we just have too much inertia in government. And actually, that's not true. It's not that we don't have geeks in government. It's that the geeks will only want to come in if government's remit is very different from what it is now. The reason Obama was able to, in 2009, attract a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, a Chinese-American called Steve Chu, to become the head of the Department of Energy was not because he said, we need, geeks in government to help us do carbon taxes or to de-risk, great companies like Tesla. It was, we're going to steer an $800 billion stimulus program, which they had at the same time that we were doing austerity over here, in a green direction. Right? So you have Steve Chu at Stanford, top physicist thinking about energy saying, wow, I'm happy to be at the center of that, right? Steer an economy with $800 billion in a green direction. Then we know what happened, a lot of kind of, internal battles in the US government with the Tea Party, so on and so forth. But still, there was a real kind of mission and challenge there. Similarly in Singapore, they actually pay their civil servants a lot more, but also they're at the center of the system. It's also a very meritocratic system.
So what do you think government should be for?
Well, for lots of things, but in terms as an economist, it's about talking just as much about the direction of growth as the rate of growth. A progressive government should be for making an economy as inclusive and sustainable as possible. It's about steering the direction in a way that is people-centered and as many people as possible benefit from the changes. But that also means that who is at the table deciding what's good for the people should also be different representatives of the people.
We're used to thinking of government as big government and small government. And people will assume that what you're describing means big government. Is it?
No, it's smart government. So, I don't want to say it's not also about resources. So the kind of austerity wave that we have here created massive problems, first of all, in the social fabric. Again, I live in London, where we had a huge wave of knife crime, not by chance. If you defund all the social fabric, youth services, public libraries, after-school clubs, mental health services, you get all sorts of social problems, which, by the way, are even bad for the economy. It costs more to pick up the mess later than to actually finance the good stuff, right? Just like with climate change, Nick Stern's report, the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. Well, it costs less to educate someone than to imprison them, right? So a lot of what austerity did, so cuts in public services, was not only just create a tragic situation for so many families and young people, and it was a human tragedy, I think, in terms of the lack of services that foster well-being, but it was also bad for the economy.
How much do you think it is chicken and egg in terms of the people who are going into government? If you're a bright young thing now coming out of university, you're more likely to want to work for a tech company or a consultancy than you are to go into government or a think tank.
Absolutely.
And partly because they pay 3 times as much.
I don't actually believe that young people are going today simply to say, Goldman Sachs, Google, McKinsey and so on, just because they're getting paid more. Often it's actually more interesting. Look, go to any MBA program, Master's in Business Administration program, where managers go. They are, the kind of courses they're taking are about strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. It's all about you at the center of strategy and decision making, and we can steer the world and we can, make the world a better place.
Yeah, they're the exciting places to go and work. There's no doubt.
The narrative is that that's what the private sector is for. So, and then the public sector is literally, again, just to fix market failure. So you have all this new public management, public choice theory, sound like big words, but it's literally the curriculum that's fed to our bureaucrats globally, which then has not only been framed as at best you can fix market failures, but even worse than a market failure is a government failure. So that fear of taking any sort of risk means that you're not even experimenting. And as I mentioned before, you wouldn't know how to ride a bike if you didn't fall off, but that's true with everything. Come back to that kind of point about Steve Chu, who agreed to leave Stanford from being a top Nobel Prize winning physicist to become a civil servant. He didn't do it because of the money. Yeah. He did it because of the mission. And I don't actually mean mission in the way I usually mean it in terms of the actual design of a public policy, but the challenge, the idea that you're there to really help steer and make the world a better place, and that you are just as important as the guys and girls in the private sector. And you're going to work with them, but not at a lower position. You're not there just to facilitate. Facilitate, by the way, comes from the word facile. I'm Italian, so also from Latin. And it's just a very problematic word if you're facilitating someone. You're probably going to have an abusive relationship in the sense of public and private, right? One side is just going to keep asking you to make things easier. And chances are those things that are making it easier are just increasing profits. What was, again, really interesting with NASA is they had no excess profits clauses in the contracts. So the idea that actually they had value, and NASA was self-respecting and realized it wasn't there just to facilitate, it was there to collaborate and to actually help direct. And Kennedy, in his famous speech around the Apollo mission, he said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. And yet all the language today with the policy wonk white papers is about making something easier for someone else.
So why aren't you in government? Because you sound a bit like a consultant.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'd be paid more.
Well, because you consult governments, don't you?
Yeah, well, okay, it's a really good question. First of all, I deeply believe in education. So my father was a professor of physics. He's dedicated his entire life to nuclear fusion. We left Italy when I was 5, went to Princeton University. So I've grown up in an academic household, but also in an academic household where it wasn't academia for the sake of academia. It was kind of academia to change the thinking, to change the world. Nuclear fusion one day, hopefully, will come about. Thank you very much, Dad, who's dedicated his life to that. But for me, I don't think you can get better policy without different education. So I chose to go into academia because, Che Guevara also had the famous quote, "We need a new man." Today, we would insist a new woman, a new mindset. I believe that all these policies that I've seen in my lifetime not help us solve the sustainability issue, not help us even solve the inequality issue, because as I mentioned, a lot of policies end up just facilitating and increasing inequality. We advise governments, absolutely, but that's not our core business model. Remember that in the book, we're not just bashing consultants. I think it'd be great if we had more experts helping and advising and consulting, because no one actor, whether they're in the private or public sector, can do it on their own. The question is, who is actually consulting you? Do they have deep expertise? And two, is there a conflict of interest? Do they have any incentive to actually make you stronger if they're not going to get that second contract? And three, are we transparent about who else you're consulting for? So one of the big problems with many consulting companies is they're consulting on both sides of the street.
Right, and but just to come back to sort of your own position, so why wouldn't somebody like you work within the Treasury?
Oh, well, I've been asked. I've been asked all over the world to, including. So I have 3 citizenships. I've been asked actually from 3 different governments to, work with them. It's just not what I mean.
But do you think you can be more influential outside?
It'd be very easy to say, oh, you're, criticizing consultants and you're also advising. We want to have, I repeat, collective intelligence globally. There's one actor, the public actor, which has over the last 5 decades been convinced that it doesn't need to build its own internal capabilities. So through, our academic work, but also our policy advisory work, and also that link between theory and practice help to strengthen that so that governments ultimately are better, more capable, more creative, and can work more functionally, less dysfunctionally with other actors, is what, I'm passionate about. If I just went into the Treasury, that would just be a very different role. But I'm sure
clearly,
I have a great experience.
You and all the people you work with do what you do because you want to change the world. You want to make things better. But what you've described in the big economies is, in your terms, deeply flawed people who aren't doing what you want them to do. So,
and the people aren't deeply flawed. The institutions, the systems, the incentives are deeply flawed.
So do you feel you are able to change the world?
Well, I must say that I'm honored to have been given the opportunity. And sometimes, I don't want to say it's luck, but it might just be that I wrote the books kind of, right place, right time. So The Entrepreneurial State, for example, that I wrote back in 2013, this is its 10th anniversary, has become in different parts of the world, not so much a manifesto, but a new narrative, a new story. In the UK government, for example, I helped Greg Clark when he was Secretary of State to change the industrial strategy in this country from being sector focused. At the time, there were these 5 sectors: aerospace, automobiles, life sciences, creative sector, and finance. God, I can't believe I remember that. To change that to be actually challenge focused. The 4 challenges they chose based on the work I did with them was clean growth, healthy aging, sustainable mobility, and something they call the data economy. And within that, then I worked with David Willits, a Tory. I just say that because I, believe in working with anyone who's willing. We set up a commission for mission-oriented innovation and industrial strategy to help Greg Clark's team turn these challenges into missions. In Europe, I must say that's probably where my greatest successes and change making happened. I convinced the European Commission to stop just talking blah, blah, blah about inclusive and sustainable growth, but to actually introduce a missions instrument in its Horizon program. And so helping governments not just kind of give up and say big government, small government, austerity, or just throw money at problems because interest rates are low, and to really redesign those instruments to be as ambitious as what got us to the moon and back 50 years ago, but around climate and all our SDGs, is something I'm both wed to, but I'm starting to see that change.
Do you sometimes feel frustrated, though, that you've been in and talked to governments or politicians as individuals and they've listened, but they're not quite got it?
Yeah, but that's normal. I mean, if anyone got it right away.
I say that because, we're starting to hear Keir Starmer talk about mission-driven government.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that's not an entire coincidence. He sort of picked...
I've been talking to not only Keir's team, but also, to the Labour Party for a long time on this. And I think they've picked up on some of the, key issues. The problem is that we shouldn't confuse the outcomes, for example, growth, with what you need to do to get that growth. So having a mission on growth is not how I'd put it. For me, missions are something very specific. Basically, because I believe in these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, missions are about designing policy in a way that actually really fosters cross-sectoral, and cross-actor investment and innovation towards a goal, and then redesigning all the levers that government has, like procurement, again, budgeting, grants, and loans to really galvanize and catalyze the bottom-up experimentation to get there. But if the goal isn't clear, did we get to the moon and back in a short amount of time? Some say it never happened, conspiracy theorists. Let's forget that bit. But yes, right? We can actually answer, yes, it happened. With most of the SDGs, like most of these broad challenges around health and climate inequality, they're too broad. Like you can't actually answer yes or no. So it allows a lot of the blah, blah, blah. So having, metrics that, targeted outcomes that require openness, so lots of different actors to get there, and redesigning those tools to really foster that bottom-up experimentation, that's a mission. So what does that mean for health? It's not just about glorifying the NHS. It means actually really strengthening the NHS's own ability to then work with some other actors, not privatizing health, but working with other actors towards particular goals.
Is a mission actually too complicated for politics?
No, I mean, missions are what everyone wants.
Well, I mean, at the moment, so you look at what Keir Starmer's come out with, it's not clear whether people have really understood what he's talking about when he talks about missions and why that's different to a plan or a goal. Or,
So you're absolutely right. And that's why we have to be very careful that we're not just, I see it in my own profession. People talked about smart growth. They talked about, all sorts of words. And then I can come up with missions. Are these just words? For me, no. They are about being very clear on what the investment trajectory is to actually solve a problem. And so...
so do you think you need that detail? I mean, should these missions have been announced with the plan?
Yeah, I mean, give them a bit of time. I mean, hopefully as soon as they get into government, they'll, get really smart teams to be working through what this means. But for me, having a mission-oriented approach is an uncomfortable space. It means that your relationship with the private sector, for example, will be very different from what it currently is now. It's not about being, as I said before, business-friendly. It's about having a collaboration where the design of the contract isn't just going to socialize risks and privatize rewards, but also socialize the rewards, for example, something I've talked about for a very long time. Whether it's how you, have a better pricing strategy for drugs, so taxpayers aren't paying once, twice, 3 different times, across all the different ways that the state is contributing, whether it's how you might also retain equity in some investments. I made the case that Obama wasn't very smart with Tesla. After the financial crisis, as I mentioned, they steered the fiscal stimulus in a green direction. That meant they gave guaranteed loans to many companies that were green, including Tesla. Tesla got $465 million in a guaranteed loan. Solyndra, which everyone knows about because it went bust, got $500 million. But it was a classic case where things go bad, government picks up the bill, guaranteed loan, $500 million, became another picking winners story that people talked about. Tesla does well. Oh, it must be Elon Musk. He's a genius. What he should have done is structured that loan program through a portfolio. And instead of saying, which is what they said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we want 3 million shares in your company, they should have done the opposite. And, why would you want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back its loan? Tesla did well. It did pay back the loan. Had the agreement been a wise one and not a naive one, the price per share went from 9 to 90 between 2009, 2013. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. People realize how wrong it is that during a cost of living crisis, the energy companies are, making billions, not because they did anything better. They're just earning massive rents, half of which, by the way, today is being spent on just buying back shares, which boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. So there is that strong inequity embedded in our system, and all of this, my work for the last kind of 20 years, or I can't remember how old I am, that's 30 years, I'm 30 years old, no, has all been about how do we redesign the capitalist system. I do believe that there's varieties of capitalism, and definitely in the UK, we have a financialized form of capitalism. We have one where the state, unfortunately, has stopped believing in itself, and it's not about big state, small state.
What do you mean by financialized?
Financialized means, well, there's two. I've written about this in my book, The Value of Everything. There's 2 different ways I look at financialization, both what's happened to the financial sector, which something like 80% of finance in the UK funds other bits of the financial sector, meaning finance, insurance, and real estate. Something like 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, real estate, but also the business sector isn't necessarily reinvesting its profits back into the economy, let alone a greener economy, which is what I need. In Sweden, they have a mission for school meals. School meals have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. That's because they have a high-level mission of having a fossil-free welfare state, and it lands on something as simple as school meals. But then that means that the supply chain for the school meals has to be green, which means innovation, right? Because it changes, it requires transformation. Imagine if in the north of England, where we have, even though I'm an Arsenal supporter, I'll mention a Manchester player, but Marcus Rashford, who I think did amazing, amazing work around free school meals during COVID, saying that he himself would not have become a footballer without the nutrition that he had in his school, and just really sensing the suffering of a lot of kids globally in the UK. Around that crisis, which was a crisis from austerity. It was not an inevitable crisis. Imagine if something like that, which was so important, which was strengthening one part of the welfare state, also becomes a funnel for innovation. So it's not just, yes, school meals, no school meals, free school meals. It's about how do you turn that into the best, most healthy, tasty, and sustainable school meals, and what does it mean for the change that's required across the whole supply chain, and this is really important, the participation perhaps of the kids in the schools that can help co-create and co-design the meals.
Well, this whole conversation has been about change, but if you could just change the world in one way, what would you do?
Well, not surprisingly, I would focus on the issues around the state. And if we could just really change the narrative around bureaucracy and just really believe in creative, edgy, even sexy bureaucracies, and believe that that's essential to solving the problems with other actors. It's not just the bureaucracy, but that would really help, because that would then dismantle this cartoon image of the Kafkian bureaucrat versus the really cool Elon Musk, and realize that actually we need that craziness on both sides.
Mariana Mazzucato, thank you very much indeed for
Thank
sharing
you.
your way to change the world.